Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Poema podcast. I am James Prescott, your host. Welcome to the show. It's really great to have you all back with us again, and I am very excited for this episode and this little series that we're starting. And we're going to be talking about a lot of things. We're going to talk about grief. We're going to be talking about mythology, superheroes, and lots of things in between that over the next few episodes. And I'm delighted that my guest for these episodes is my friend Amanda Held Opelt. Welcome back to the show.
It's so good to be back, James. Thank you for having me.
I always love having you on the show because I always feel like we've got a lot of common ground in some of the things that we talk about and but yet have different perspectives on it, which is really good. So I'm excited to talk about it.
Yeah.
And especially because it's characters that I really love talking about. So
Well, yes, and I am here to be educated because I love mythology. I love shared stories. I love the concept of the hero's story arc, all of these things. And yet, I will say, I've told you this before, I am not an avid fan of the superhero world. I'm the kind of person that will casually go to the movies if my friends are going to the movies to see a Batman film or see, whatever, Justice League, whatever. But I'm not an avid fan. And you are the only person in the world who has given me any sense of interest in this stuff. And I realized as I've kind of follow your tweets and your reflections on kind of this world that actually these characters are in some ways our modern day folklore, our modern day folk heroes, our modern day mythologies, these shared stories that we absorb together. And so I'm like, okay, I need to pay attention to this. And there's one person that can help me do this, and it's you.
oh, that's fantastic. Wow, what a compliment. Thank you. Um, yeah, I mean that's why I love these stories. I think it's because, and I said this on other podcasts where I've talked about these characters, but these characters, the reason that we love them, I think, the reason people love them is that they can resonate with them. There's elements of their stories that they connect with.
Yeah.
And it's normally their humanity, which is ironic because they're superheroes, right? But it's just it's the kind of conflicts that they deal with, and often they're relational conflicts or personal conflicts, and a lot of superheroes, they've been through some kind of trauma because most superheroes have been through a form of trauma, right?
Yeah.
The number of superhero stories where there's either a broken relationship with a parent, or the loss of a parent, or the loss of a loved one, which kind of pushes them to become who they become. Like, is it's profound. There's a lot of them. There's a lot of them. With Spider-Man, you've got Uncle Ben, right? With
Yeah.
Batman, with who we're going to talk about today, you've got his parents being murdered in front of him when he's 8 years old, right, or 12 years old. I think it's one of those two. And with Superman, like in some Superman stories, not all of them, but some of them, he loses his father when he's still very young. So like, there's a lot of stories. Iron Man, like he doesn't, his father doesn't get killed in front of him or anything, but he has a difficult relationship with his father, um, who dies before before we meet Iron Man, and a lot of his journey is about resolving that relationship, and trying to figure out why his dad was like he was, and all of that. So yeah, there's a lot of grief involved in the
Yeah.
superhero world and trauma, and a lot of us experience that. And I think these people become who they become, not despite what they go through, but as part of the process of healing. And that's very true with the first character we're going to talk about, Batman. I don't know how familiar you are with the story of Batman, but if people don't know it,
Yes,
Um,
pretend let's pretend, James, that there are some people listening to this story that are like, or to this podcast that are like me, and they're kind of novices. They're kind of like, okay, I think I have general idea. Sometimes I get his backstory mixed up with others, So let's pretend like you're introducing. If you could give the 3 to 5 minute introduction to a novice, I think that would be great.
yeah, that's a good idea. So there's this person called Bruce Wayne. He is the son of a billionaire. He comes from a rich family, old money. They're very, very wealthy. One of the richest families in the world. And when he is a young boy, he goes to the theatre with his parents. And on the way home from the theatre, his parents are robbed and shot dead in front of him, and he is just left there sitting by their dead bodies, basically. And of course, that's a very traumatic experience, and uh, he resolves then to fight crime, to stop things like this happening again, right? Um, Now, like, there's one movie called Batman Begins, which I think is the best. I think that's a definitive origin of Batman in the movies, so I recommend that to people if you haven't watched it already. It's a
That is
great
one.
movie.
That is one I think I have seen. So I've not seen them all, but that is one that I have
Yeah,
seen.
that's a definitive origin of Batman for me, on screen anyway, not in the comic books, obviously, but on screen, that's the definitive origin. And in that story, he initially wants to just kill the man that killed his parents. And then that doesn't happen. Somebody else kills him before he can. And then he kind of has this wake up call of like, maybe revenge isn't the best idea. So what he does basically is disappears. He travels the world. He travels the criminal underworld. He learned about what being criminal is like. He learned about. He trained himself as a detective to become the best detective in the world. This isn't covered in Batman Begins as much. And he trains himself physically to learn, basically to kind of all the martial arts, everything. But beyond that as well, to become become one of the best people in the world at all of those things. And then he comes back to Gotham, his home, Gotham City, um, which you could argue is kind of a modern day, like a comic book version of Chicago, where you've got a lot of mob, where the mob is kind of quite strong and there's lots of corruption and all of that. And he comes back and decides he needs to take on a persona to fight criminals, right? And because he's always been afraid of bats, and he goes down to this cave underneath his house because they live in this massive mansion. So it's got this massive cave underneath, and there's loads of bats there, and it just inspires him. And he says, "Right, I will become a bat." And then he uses all the resources at Wayne Enterprises, uh, that the company that his family's wealth is built on, and he becomes Batman. And there's one person at Wayne Enterprises who knew his parents, and uh, called uh, called Fox, right? Lucius Fox. And there's all this technology at Wayne Enterprises, like including like the bodysuit and all the gadgets and everything, which were invented as like weapons and never used. Which this is in the movie anyway. And he takes all this stuff, including like the body armor and everything, and turns it into his bat suit, basically.
Yeah.
And the mask and everything, he puts that on, and he goes out and fights crime in Gotham as Batman, right? On his own. And in the comic books, he eventually takes on a sidekick, Robin, who helps him fight crime. And there's several Robins. Robin actually himself lost his parents. The first version, anyway, Dick Grayson. His parents died. He was the son of people who worked in the circus on the Trapeze Act, and they died when like criminals cut the rope because
Oh,
they were.
wow.
And so he saw his parents die, and Bruce Wayne saw it happen as well, so adopted him. and then he ends up becoming Robin. So that's kind of the Robin story. And there's lots of different Robins in the comics, but I won't go into that because it can get a bit confusing. So now in the movies, like Batman is well, not just in the movies, but it's very clear in the movies that Batman is like the vehicle that he uses to express his grief. He's like a different character when he puts on the mask. So all like the anger, the rage, the grief, the all that kind of thing just suddenly comes out when he's in that mask. It's almost like when he puts the mask on, it gives him permission.
Yeah.
And I personally think his journey is at the first he has to become Batman. He's almost like is Batman to start with, because he's not free of Batman. Batman almost controls him in a sense. It's like he can't not be Batman. And the whole journey of Batman is that certainly in the Dark Knight trilogy, which I think is a great character arc for Bruce Wayne, is actually learning and this is tackled in other movies as well, actually, of not having to be Batman, but choosing to be Batman.
Yes, this sense of
I don't. Yeah.
Almost like a sense of agency that you have over your grief and how it impacts you and what it makes of you. That not that you have complete and full control over it, but that you have finally some sense of agency to use it in the way that it needs to be used, as opposed to it using you.
Yeah, absolutely. That's it. And that taught me, as somebody who'd lost parents as well, I resonate with that. It's this is even more clear actually in the recent Batman movie called The Batman with Robert Pattinson, which is kind of takes place in Batman's second year. So it's not an origin story, but you can see at the beginning of the movie, it's full on rage, it's full on anger, like he's just beating people up, and trying to scare them. And yes, he wants to rid Gotham of crime and all of that, but like it's kind of not that methodical. It's kind of out of control a bit, and he still has boundaries, like he won't kill people, which is really important part of Batman's character. Actually, he won't kill people. He has boundaries. He has moral boundaries, like that he won't cross, and which kind of separates him out from his enemies, right? And but look, in this movie, he starts off being like, he calls himself Vengeance at the start of the movie, like I am Vengeance. Like everyone's seen that. There's a trailer where that's like the big thing, I am Vengeance. And then I'll probably end up giving away a bit of this movie, but like as the movie goes on, he almost loses his butler Alfred, who's kind of like his father figure. He kind of brought him up when his parents died, so they're very close, and it is like a parent-child relationship almost. And he knows that he's Batman and has helped him be Batman, right? So, but he almost dies. And they'd had a big falling out before this, but he almost dies, and then Bruce has this moment of like, I didn't realize I could feel this way. I didn't realize I would be scared of losing somebody again. But I was scared of losing you. And then they have this moment where they make up, and he realizes like, this is not about just my vengeance. This is about like, it's kind of a big moment in his character arc. And then he goes out again as Batman, and his enemy in the movie is the Riddler, right? Who is basically just blowing up corrupt politicians. So they're not good people that he's killing; they're bad people. But he's doing it because he thinks that's the way to stop bad people. And when he actually meets Batman in prison, like he says, "Well, I'm just doing this because this is what you were doing. You inspired me." Like he thinks he's on the same side as Batman, right? And this is like a big moment for Batman. He's like, is this what I'm inspiring people to be? Like, and then one of the Riddler's henchmen comes to fight Batman in like the finale, and he says, "I am vengeance," and Batman is there, and he looks at him, and he's like, he just like has this like, whoa, this is what I was doing, isn't it? Like, And it's just, and again, and just after that happens, he literally almost sacrifices himself to save these people in this building, which is kind of being flooded. So he goes and takes this like flare, and literally there's this amazing shot of him leading people out of the water
Mm.
to safety, and it's such a profound moment because he's no longer just trying to avenge people. He's no longer just being vengeful. He's
Yeah.
actually saving people. And at the end
Yeah.
of the movie, he has this little monologue where he talks about like how vengeance doesn't change the past, and that he needs to that people need hope,
Yeah.
and they need, and that that I'm a scarred person. This city is scarred, and I can that maybe if we process these scars, we can learn to have the courage to fight. To have the
Yeah.
courage to survive, kind of thing. And it's like this. I felt so hopeful at the end of that movie, and it's a Batman movie. You're not meant to feel hopeful at
Yeah.
the end of a Batman movie,
Yeah.
and so
Well, and I love the
that's basically
image.
kind of Bruce's story is
Yeah.
going from like just vengeance and rage and pure raw grief to like how can processing this grief transform me and then make me be a symbol of hope for this city, which is
Yeah.
also scarred and hurting and going through stuff. So
I
that's kind
love
of the
the
Batman story.
image I love the image of him leading people out of the water because water is so often used as a metaphor for grief or chaos or uncertainty or fear. There's so much about water that feels uncontrollable, and so
Mm.
it's really cool that's this space that he's leading people out of, even as he's stepping in some ways out of his own kind of the chaos of his own grief in a more, I guess, kind of, I don't want to say manageable form of grief, but like he knows his grief now. He knows what it's done to him, how it's transformed him, and how he needs to go forward, you know?
Yeah, it's a powerful story, and I rewatched the Dark Knight trilogy recently, and it really is like a three-act story. Like when it wasn't made, it wasn't the funny thing about that trilogy is it wasn't planned as a trilogy in advance. They made each movie individually without thinking of a sequel, and but it turned into a great three-act story, like the story of Bruce Wayne, basically.
Yeah.
And I actually, at the end of the Dark Knight Rises, which is the third movie, I've never felt so satisfied at the end of a character arc because it was so brilliantly done and it was so right. Like what happens at the end of the movie, where he finally is free
Yeah.
and he is no longer Batman and he's living his life anonymously, like he's happy.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he has this moment with Alfred, who sees that he's happy, and like it's just, and some passes the mantle of Batman onto somebody else,
Yeah.
and it's like and it's just like it's like the completion of his story. That as in like my grief no longer controls me.
Yeah.
I
That's
am
right.
I am a master of I am not I suppose the master of my grief. I have processed my grief. I have worked it through,
Yes.
and I have
Yeah.
found myself. And within that, yeah.
Yeah. I'm interested in hearing more from you about this kind of origin story of the loss of parental figure early on. And I've been watching a lot of Disney movies lately because I have kids. I've got a 4-year-old who's just now getting to a point where she's watching movies and things like that. And so,
No,
oh boy, I feel like that could be a whole podcast series, is like millennials processing the Disney movies they watched as young people. Because there's some stuff that did not age well, let me tell you. But beyond that, I've noticed that in a lot of these Disney films, almost all of them, the main character has either one or two parents missing. That the parent is not there because of some tragic accident, or sometimes we don't even know why they're not there, but there's a missing mother figure and a strained relationship with the father, or both parents are missing and they're being raised by an evil stepmother, whatever the case may be. And it's just this theme I noticed over and over again. I heard somewhere that Walt Disney actually lost his parents. Have you heard this story?
no, I don't know this
So
story.
Walt Disney, when he was, so this is when he was grown. Apparently, his parents, it was all he ever wanted, to provide a nice home for them once he kind of made his millions as Mr. Disney, and so he bought them a really nice house in a nice neighborhood. They were getting older, and apparently there was kind of a gas smell of some kind in the house. His parents called, and I think he may have called the fire department, something like that. But whatever the case may be, it was either dismissed or it wasn't addressed soon enough. And his parents died in this horrible accident of a gas explosion, and in the home that he had bought them. And so I've heard some people theorize that maybe Walt Disney had a real was really inclined to tell the stories of orphaned children, particularly those maybe who wish they could have saved their parent, wish they could have had that relationship with their parent. So I think it's just an interesting. Every grief is so different, right? Like losing a spouse is different than losing a parent. Losing a parent to illness, maybe they don't pass away, but you lose who you knew them to be because of illness, or maybe it's a family divorce, separation, whatever. You lose the normalcy of the relationship you had. Losing a child versus losing a parent. All that to say, I think what's unique about a child losing a parent is just the feeling of security and safety in your most formative years being rocked to the core, and how that impacts you in your life going forward. So it's really interesting to me that this Batman character had that experience of trauma and loss, losing his most important security space of security at such an early age,
Yeah, and it really does affect him. He's very lucky in that he has Alfred. Alfred is a fundamentally good person. He's kind. He is honest. He's one of the only people that Bruce Wayne trusts. Bruce Wayne doesn't trust many people, and I mean, the Alfred in the Dark Knight trilogy is, I think, the best Alfred of all. It's played by Michael Caine, and he is absolutely brilliant. Him and Christian Bale have this great chemistry, and it's
Yeah.
very much a father-son relationship. And
Yeah.
and his concern all along is, how can I protect Bruce? Like, how can I? Because ultimately, we find out in the end that he didn't want him to be Batman. He just wanted him to go and escape and have a life, and just live anonymously away from Gotham and just forget what had happened.
Yeah.
And be happy. And ironically, that's what, and he finds that in the end, so that's good.
Yeah.
But he never wanted him to be Batman. But he helps him because he understands, because he cares about Bruce, and he understands why this is important to him.
Yeah.
And he's a big part of Batman's world, and he's kind of like the heart of the Batman story in a sense. He's kind of the soul of the story. Like, and without Alfred, Bruce probably would have probably gone off the rails completely, right? And might have even become a villain. It's
Yeah.
it's kind of that he's kind of that moral guide and that heart that Bruce needs. So he's a very important character.
So I want to hear your opinion then on, like, what is it that's different between, say, a Batman character and a Riddler character? Who is the one where their grief transforms them into the hero versus the grief that transforms them into the villain?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, that, because in the Batman, the movie, the Riddler is an adopted child who lost his parents, but he is in poverty, right? So he has nothing, and so he is not treated well. He is not nurtured. He is not looked after properly, and like doesn't have a moral guide. Doesn't have that. Basically, he's like downtrodden by society. He's he's kind of an oppressed person in society, and he's never processed his grief. And he's definitely got I want to be very sensitive here. Like, in the movie, certainly he's not. There's elements of like being a psychopath, or a sociopath,
Yeah.
in his personality,
Yeah.
and so that's an element of it. To be honest,
Yeah.
like, but he has somehow convinced himself that the only way to get justice is by killing people and doing it in a horrible way, like torturing them.
Yeah.
He thinks, like a lot of villains, and this is a really interesting concept as well, like the hero and the villain. What is a villain? Is he thinks he's doing the right? He thinks he's to be a hero.
Yeah.
That I'm killing all these corrupt politicians who have taken money from criminals and have lied to you and are not acting in your interest. I mean, and politicians can be corrupt. So he sees himself as like a hero, and for some people, he is a hero. Like he's
Yeah.
got this little group of this little following who think like he's the deliverer of justice, for oppressed
Yeah.
people.
Yeah.
Now, which is really interesting because one conversation I love to have is like we talk about heroes and villains, and this is a very binary concept. But actually,
Yes.
for me, when I've done my deconstruction and my grief work and all of that, it starts to help you see that there's actually a bit of nuance here. That's a very binary.
Yeah.
They're very binary concepts, but actually there's a bit of, and we see this in Star Wars a lot as well, because there's the Sith, and there's who is like evil, and then there's the Jedi who are kind of good, but
Yeah.
they're all about certainty. They're all about rigid rules and structure and stuff. And then then on the other side, there's like the Sith, where you can express your emotions, you can talk about your emotions, but it's all in a negative way. And
Yeah.
then there turns out to be this like middle ground which is like grey,
Yeah.
where you're allowed to express your emotions, you're allowed to have attachments, you're allowed to have relationships, you're allowed to process emotions, and you don't have to stick to some rigid code. You can
Yeah.
still be a good person,
Yeah.
and that's the tragedy of Anakin Skywalker, is that he needs to be in the grey. Like
Yeah.
he had to leave his parent behind when he was 8 years old, and then 10 years later she died, and he saw her die, and he never had a proper parental figure apart from
Yeah.
Obi-Wan Kenobi, who was really old enough to be his brother rather than his father figure.
Yeah.
And so he didn't get parented properly, and he was brought up in this rigid code, which he
Yeah.
felt which like he had to fit into, and it was either that or the Sith. There wasn't like
Yeah.
and he had all this grief and emotion that he was dealing with, and
Yeah.
nowhere to process it. So in the end, he gets so afraid of losing his wife and losing the children that she's carrying, that he turns to the dark side in order to get some kind of control.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's the tragedy. When actually, if he'd had therapy and
Yeah.
there was some kind of, and he had someone who could guide into like this grey area in between, he wouldn't have fallen to
Yeah.
the dark side. He wouldn't have become
Yeah.
evil. And that's kind of the tragedy, like that he wasn't evil to start with. He was
Yeah.
made evil by circumstances and by mismanagement of his grief
Yeah.
and his trauma. Like, and that can be a villain story for a lot of characters, right?
Yeah.
That they had a trauma and they didn't deal with it well, and it wasn't handled well, and they thought so they found like control, and vengeance and all of these things are the only ways that they can process this stuff, and they
Yeah.
become villains.
Yeah.
And so there's like, and Batman actually kind of skirts this a lot. It's like, because some people call Batman a vigilante and that he's outside the law, and like, is he a criminal or isn't he a criminal? Like, and the Batman kind of explores this a bit as well, like this kind of grey area of like, where is Batman in this area, and
Yeah.
and what is the difference between him and the Riddler, who
Yeah.
ultimately want to achieve the same ends. Like
Yeah.
they both want to end corruption in Gotham City. Like, it's just that Batman has boundaries and he won't cross them. He won't kill people.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
the Riddler doesn't have those boundaries. He doesn't have
Yeah.
any boundary. He just like he will just do what is necessary, and
Yeah.
it's a really interesting concept. And it's yeah,
It is. I think that that question of the binary of the hero and the villain, when it's really in some ways a spectrum of the, like, we all have this like capacity for evil and good in us, and where is it that you kind of cross this line into harming other people and harming yourself versus serving other people and serving your own needs and in a good way and tending to your grief. Yeah, I think that there this yeah, categorizing people as either a villain or a hero is not, that's maybe not the way forward, because grief can go one of so many directions in all of our lives, you know.
exactly. Yeah, and that's why the concept of the anti-hero is interesting.
Hmm. Yeah.
You know, like Deadpool is an example of that.
Mhm.
In many ways, I mean, because he's not what you would call a hero, but he's not a bad guy. You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
and so yeah, I mean, there's a lot of characters like that, which are you kind of like wouldn't be the traditional good guy, and but aren't the bad guy.
Yeah.
Um, uh, like I mean, it wasn't a great movie, but Black Adam kind of explored this a bit,
Hmm.
where he is historically he is a liberator of an oppressed people,
Yeah.
right? But but white America gets involved and sees him as a villain
Yeah.
because they don't know how to deal with this kind of nuance of like when actually his backstory is that he was given these powers to liberate his people from being slaves,
Yeah.
which is a good thing.
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
and but because of the trauma, he's kind of got less boundaries than what you call a hero. So
Yeah.
it's seen as a villain, right?
Yeah.
And so that's an interesting concept. It's a shame they didn't explore it very well. It wasn't a very good movie, but that basic concept is really interesting because it's like that's like how do you deal with a character that this is why Superman and Batman's relationship is always really interesting. And we'll get
Yeah.
to Superman in I think probably the next episode, but because Superman is sincere, he is good, he's idealistic, he will not kill people, he will not harm people, like
Yeah.
he is almost sincere to the point of naivety, like he's kind of a dork and just a generally good person who
Yeah.
believes in people and believes the best about people, whereas Batman is like almost the opposite. And
Yeah.
so there's always this interesting dynamic with Superman and Batman of because they're almost trying to do the same thing, but they have different ways of doing it,
Yeah.
and so they have an interesting relationship, and it's an interesting dynamic that they have because they have to. Well, they learn. I think what happens in the comics is they learn to grudgingly respect each other
Ah,
and
yeah.
accept that for where each of them are in the world, that the way that they do things kind of works.
Yeah. Yeah.
And even though they don't necessarily agree with it all the time, they understand why they do it. Like, and often they end up working together as well. Like, which is, and they end up helping each other
Hmm.
grow a little bit,
Yeah.
which is that's why that whole concept that I hope they explore this in the upcoming DC movies as well. Like that this dynamic between Superman and Batman because it's this idea that they fight each other all the time is not like that happened in one comic book.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Most of
Yeah.
the time in the comic books, they're kind of allies, most
Yeah.
of the time, and um, so but it's an interesting dynamic because they're very different characters, and even though both of them actually have been through the loss of a parent, they're
Hmm.
very different characters, and so
Yeah.
but we'll explore Superman in another episode, but it's yeah, that's an interesting dichotomy.
Yeah. The story of Batman reminds me of this story from Celtic mythology that's not a very well known story, that I wrote about in my book about grief, and I was introduced to the story by the mythologist Sharon Blackie. Are you familiar with Sharon Blackie at all?
No, I haven't heard of
She's
her. No.
She wrote this phenomenal book called If Women Rose Rooted, and she primarily focuses on the feminine mythology within Celtic folklore, and she's from the British Isles and does her work there. And anyway, she tells the story of this young woman named Miss, or Mish, I guess is how you would pronounce it
Yeah.
in the Celtic language. Who's this, beautiful young woman, and her father was this powerful ruler who went to fight. He went to, I guess they were from Europe, and they went to Ireland to invade and fight the famed warrior Finn McCool. A lot of people, maybe not a lot of people in America, but if you have any kind of knowledge of Celtic mythology, Finn McCool is like
Mm.
keeps appearing again and again, and we could do a whole episode on him. But so I guess this big battle happened between Mish's father and Finn McCool in County Kerry, Ireland, and essentially Mish's father and all the warriors were killed, slaughtered on the beach. And she is this young woman who is searching and searching for her father, and finally finds him there, slain on the beach. And her grief, in her moment of grief, she kind of shapeshifts and turns, kind of morphs into this wild creature, with feathers and fur and claws. Like basically, she just, in as the story goes, her body rises up from the beach, from her father's dead body, and into the air, and she just shapeshifts into this wild creature and flies off into the mountains, and basically then haunts the mountains of Slieve Mish, which is a real place in Ireland. And this is a story of those mountains. But basically, the story goes that everyone from that area was afraid to go into the Mish Mountains because of this creature who had been so transformed by her grief that she would tear apart anyone that came into the mountains. And she could, fly as fast as the wind, and was just vicious and powerful. And all of this had happened because of her grief. And so I guess the surrounding kingdoms tried to figure out what to do about this for years. Like, how do we take back the Mish Mountains, because she's terrorizing us? And what they ended up doing was sending in this young, gentle harpist, who decided that he was just going to seek her out and be gentle with her and play songs to her on his harp. And he eventually, brought her food to eat. He took her over to the pond so that she could look at her own reflection and actually see what had happened to her. And eventually, as the story goes, they fall in love. But I don't think it matters that it's a romance story. To me, it's a story of this gentle harpist that goes and loves this wild creature in her grief, and it is through love that she is transformed back. And she doesn't come back as the woman she was before. She's transformed into something completely different afterwards, but she's no longer terrorizing people. She's no longer haunting these mountains. And if
Wow.
you're okay with it, I'll read. Sharon Blackie just wrote this really beautiful write up about what grief had done to this young woman, Mish. She says,
Mm.
sometimes madness seems like the only possible response to the insanity of the civilized world. Sometimes holding ourselves together is not an option, and the only way forward is to allow ourselves to fall apart. As the story of Mish shows, that madness can represent an extreme form of initiation, a trigger for profound transformation. This old story shows us a brutal descent into darkness, during which all illusions are stripped away and old belief systems evaporate. And in doing so, it suggests that the extremities of madness or mental breakdown, with their prolonged, out of control descent into the unknown, might offer us a path through which we can come to terms with the truth. And I just love that. There's obviously so much sensitivity that needs to be shown around either mental health, and the impact that grief can have on your mental health. But I think she says, like, well, the beauty of this story I think what she's getting at is that it gives permission to fall apart and to go into that really dark, dark space, and to see that and not as a not as something that should be avoided, but that as something that actually makes space for the transformation that's needed. It actually makes space for the accepting of reality. Whereas everyone else was afraid of Mish, this gentle young harpist was not afraid and said, I will love you and walk with you through the journey of transformation. So what you're sharing that made me think of that is I think about this butler. I mean, what seems to be a difference to me between Batman and Riddler is an intervention of love and an intervention of someone who made space
Mm,
for
mm,
the grief. And that's why Mish was able to transform from this, dangerous, violent creature back into a young woman again, was because she was loved through it and seen and tended to, as opposed to fought and opposed. Someone came alongside her. I kind of see that in the Batman character as what made it possible for his grief to transform him in a way
yeah.
that was healthy.
Yes, that's right. He was loved. He was loved deeply by Alfred and cared for and brought
Yeah.
up by him, basically. And I think that is his moral compass in a sense. Like
Yeah.
that's his heart. That's what balances him out. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting that in Batman Begins, the enemy that he faces up to is the person that trained him.
Mm.
And this is a character played by Liam Neeson in the movie,
Oh, yeah. Mhm.
called it's Ra's al Ghul, and basically his character is a contrast to Bruce's character because he lost his wife,
Mm.
like his great love, he calls her, and from that moment he's devoted his whole life to vengeance.
Mm.
So again, the League of Shadows, who he leads, their whole idea is that they go around the world, they basically destroy societies,
Yeah.
like purge cities, kill people in order to deliver justice.
Yeah.
Right? That they believe they have a moral right to do this, and that this is vengeance, and this is the
Mm.
way to deliver justice. And they try to, when they train Bruce, to say this is what it means. This is what this means. This is what you have to do now.
Yeah.
And then Bruce says, no, no, like this is not how you do this. This is not how you deliver justice.
Right.
And so he destroys the League of Shadows, but he saves Ra's al Ghul, thinking that he is. Well, he doesn't think he's Ra's al Ghul at that point. He thinks he's Ducard. That's the
Mm.
name he uses for himself. He thinks that this guy's still morally good, but
Yeah.
or somehow he won't kill the person that trained him. He has a like compassion,
Mm.
and of course he ends up becoming his enemy and going to Gotham, and that's Batman's big enemy in this movie. Right, it's almost like his own past is his enemy, and it's yeah. I mean that's a really interesting that's why that movie is really really good. I recommend that to everybody, especially people who are new to Batman. That's the Batman movie to start with because that's his story. That's how he becomes who he is.
Yeah.
And it's a very good movie. I mean, Christopher Nolan is a great director, and
Yeah.
the cast
Yeah.
is incredible in that movie. You've got Morgan Freeman, Michael Caine, Christian Bale, Liam Neeson, like Katie Holmes. They're all in that movie. It's a really really good movie, and it's a really good origin story, and
Yeah.
it's a good exploration of grief and how you process grief. Yeah.
And didn't Hans Zimmer do the music for some of these films? I see.
He
Yeah.
did. He did the music for the Dark Knight trilogy. Yes, he did.
Okay. I'm such a fan of Hans Zimmer. I'll watch any movie he composes the
Yeah, the
music
music's
for.
brilliant as well.
Yeah.
Like it's great. Yeah. Yeah, it's very yeah. It's to me it's one of the greatest movie trilogies of all time. It's up there with Lord of the Rings, and the original Star Wars trilogy is like one of the best
Yeah. So
trilogies. Yeah.
The other question I want to ask you, I have kind of a two-part question just as it relates to stories that compel us and shared stories that we. So I'll ask one now and then I'll ask the next one when we talk about Superman. But I think the first I want to hear your thoughts on is why does mythology matter and why do story because I'm kind of a mind that these shared cultural stories that we have. You mentioned Star Wars, right? You mentioned, whether it's superheroes, maybe Lord of the Rings, whatever the case may be. In fact, I think I've heard it said that J.R.R. Tolkien wrote Lord of the Rings. It was either him or C.S. Lewis writing The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe
C.S.
series. But
Lewis, the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Yeah.
yes, but what I mean is one of them said this. It was either Tolkien said this about Lord of the Rings or Lewis said it about Lion, the Witch, and the
Oh
Wardrobe.
yeah.
But,
Right.
but that they felt like Britain did not really have its own mythology. That other, there's Norse mythology, there's ancient Greek mythology, there's some Celtic mythology, and obviously, like there are mythological stories that come from the British Isles. But he felt like there was a lack of
Mm.
shared
Mm.
story, and so he almost wanted. And I'll have to look it up if it was Lewis saying this about the story world of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, or the Narnia series, or if it was Tolkien about the Lord of the Rings story world. But that those two hung out together, so they probably both felt that same way. But that they
Yeah.
felt there was kind of a lack of this shared mythology. I've often felt that way about America too. Is that because we come from so many cultures? There's this kind of there's I mean, it's a beautiful thing to be a melting pot. One of the challenges though is that this we don't always have this shared sense of identity. We don't necessarily have the same shared stories that draw us together. We tend to mythologize American history and make it look the way we want it to, where all the founding fathers were heroes, and we dismiss the bits about our past that we don't like or that are shameful. But I think part of our cultural confusion sometimes as America is that we don't know which heroes and stories to rally around to help define us and remind us who we are. Like mythology will often connect people to their shared history, their shared past, but also to the land that they live on.
Yeah.
Um, we have beautiful stories from our indigenous peoples here that are lost and ignored and not paid attention to because indigenous stories are so marginalized in this culture. But I guess I'm just saying I've just been reflecting on what is why are we drawn to, because I'll
Mm.
be honest to tell you something, and you might hold a grudge against me for saying it, James. But sometimes I see like, oh, we got another superhero movie coming out, or another iteration of the Batman story, or another
Mm.
iteration of the Spider-Man
Yeah.
story. And
Sure. No, I get it. Yeah.
like, come on. Like, what how many times can we tell this story? In talking to you, I'm beginning to understand because there's something that speaks to the humanity in us. We see ourselves through these characters. And so we're hungry for more iterations and more
Yeah.
perspectives on them because of that. So how do you think these superhero characters are stepping in kind of a modern Western, in the function of mythology for modern Western culture? Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
Yeah. No, I genuinely believe that superheroes are kind of modern mythology. They play a lot of the same roles. If you look at like historical mythological characters, like all the traditional ones, that there's a lot of Superman in one of them, in some of them, but there's a lot of Batman in one of them. Like it's like it's yeah, I know exactly what you mean, and it I think that they are for some people. Like from it's funny, it's interesting actually. The number of people he would call geeks or nerds or whatever who are into superheroes who are neurodivergent,
Hmm.
and or who have been through some kind of trauma,
Yeah.
right? Um, because we and the reason is that we identify with these characters, and they almost become like our friends, right?
Yes.
Like, I mean, I have this friend I talk to about Superman on Twitter, who loves Superman as much as I do, and we call him our friend. He is.
Yeah.
There's a famous interview with Christopher Reeve from 1987, I think, and he embodied the character more than anybody else ever has. We'll talk about this in the Superman episode, but he so he was asked who Superman is, and he said he's a friend. He's
Mm.
a helping hand. Like, and in the movie, the 1978 movie, when Lois asks, "Who are you?" he says, "A friend."
Hmm.
Right. So it's, and that certainly was the case for me growing up.
Yeah.
And in many ways, my journey into Christianity was through Superman, because there's elements of which are similar, in terms of their character.
Yeah.
A friend, somebody who helps out, somebody who's inherently good, somebody who wants to do the right thing, somebody who cares about people, who wouldn't kill anyone, who wouldn't, harm anybody. Like, there's a lot of similarities between those two characters. Um, and I think as a child, he was who I wanted to be, and he was also like a friend for me. And he still is kind of a friend. I mean, I know that obviously he's a fictional character. I'm not completely deluded. I know he's a fictional character, but you still have relationships with these characters, right? Um, and one of the reasons I was so upset and angry about the interpretation of Superman that we've had in the movies in the last kind of 10 years or so is because it was so far away from who the character is. And when I see that, it's I always take it personally,
Yeah.
And when I see Batman killing people, on the cinema, it's like, no, that's not who this person is. Like,
Yeah.
the whole point of him being Batman and being a hero is that he doesn't do that, and that he
Yeah.
has boundaries. Like, he's like, I won't kill people. Like, I will not do that. Like, that's the easy way to, like, if you want to stop corruption and crime, that's the easy way. Just kill
Yeah.
everyone, right? Kill
Yeah.
everyone who's bad.
Yeah.
That's what the Riddler does in the Batman. That's what he
Yeah.
thinks. But actually, that's not like that's not ethical. Like, it's
Yeah.
not. Who gets to make those moral judgments about,
Yeah.
like, who deserves to die and who deserves to live? Like, it's
Right. Right.
and then the Batman doesn't do that, and neither does Superman either. Like, even though Superman's got enough power to kill anyone he likes,
Yeah.
do whatever he wants and get away with it. Nobody could stop him, but he doesn't. And that's I think that's if there's anything that distinguishes what we call heroes from villains, it's usually that kind of they have that kind of code of, like,
Yeah.
I will not kill people. I will
Some
not.
kind of a
There's
yeah.
a boundary that I will not cross at some
Yeah.
point.
It's really interesting hearing you talk about your experience, and I'll say your relationship with these two characters, because I think it's a very real relationship, and that you've had over the years. Is that with the Batman character, it feels like a relatability, like there's something in his story that mirrors your story. There's something in him that you see in
Yeah,
yourself. Whereas with the Superman character, again, while there are things that you can relate to, it's almost as if he's more of an other, of an ideal, of a safety, of a place you want to go, a place you want to be, the hero that can help you, and in that way is kind of
yeah,
different than you. And I think that's these are just some themes that I see, or why heroes are so important, and why stories where we see people with our same characteristics and same threads of meaning through our lives, but they live in a mythical world, or they live in a magical world, and they go through these kind of more fantastical transformations. It's like a picture of our life, only kind of the technicolor version of it. But in it, we see truths about our life, and in it, we see truths about ourselves and what we hope to be and what we aspire to be. And I feel like that's kind of an important function of myth, is introducing ourselves to ourselves through a fantastical story, and imagining who and what we would be if we were in those circumstances, with those powers, with those experiences, and in that way shedding light on ourselves and our collective identity even. I just think it's a really interesting experience you have with both of those characters.
yeah, absolutely. And they do kind of represent two different parts of myself. That's for sure. I think one of the reasons that Batman connects, I think, with a lot of people is that he is human. He doesn't
Hmm.
have any
Yeah.
powers.
Well, yes, and
And,
this is
like,
something that it
technically, if
took
you had,
me.
and the idea of Batman is like, technically, if you had the financial resources and the training and like the skills, technically, you could be Batman. Like that's part of, I think that's part of the attraction of Batman is that
Yeah.
he doesn't have powers, but he, like, technically you could be him. Like,
Yeah, and it took me a while to figure that out, to be honest with you. That I remember the day where I was like, "Wait a minute." Like, he doesn't have any powers? And it's like he does and he doesn't, you know what I mean? Like, and in some ways it's like his grief is his superpower. Like, it's such an odd, like,
yeah,
the work that it's done in him is the superpower.
that's a I've never heard that before, and that is very true. Yeah, yeah. He's like he's very intelligent. He's very well trained. He's obviously rich. He's got money behind him, and he's got
Mm,
like access to all this technology and everything like that. He doesn't have to account to anybody,
mm,
right? Because of that, and so there is a lot of like, um, yeah, you're right, but you're right though. Like, the thing that makes Batman who he is, in a sense, is his grief, and
yeah.
so yeah, that's really good. Oh yeah, I like that.
Well,
All
and
right,
I think
well, this seems like a good end to like
I
part
think
one,
so.
like a nice like little break point. We're just getting into, and I think it's a good time to move into talking about Superman as well. We'll do that in the next episode. And
Yes.
I'm excited about that because Superman's my favorite character of all time. Batman is
Yes,
like
so
number
come
two.
back, folks, because I have so many questions for James about Superman, and I'm so excited. So tune in.
Yes, come back next week, and we will continue this story. So thanks for listening, everybody, and we'll speak to you again next week.